Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Marjorie Schuster with the Stryker Center. Tonight, we have Jonathan Weisman, who is the congressional editor and deputy Washington editor at the New York Times. His previous novel is called Number 4 Imperial Lane, and the book we're speaking about tonight is Semitism, Being Jewish in the Age of Trump. His long journalism career has taken him to the Baltimore Sun, the USA Today, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, where he's covered Congress, presidential campaigns, the war in Afghanistan, and the Obama White House. After the event, we're going to distribute books, and he's graciously agreed to sign everybody's book, so we'll sort of go out there to the right. He's going to speak on this fascinating subject, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, so there'll be a lot of dialogue, a lot of Q&A back and forth. Mr. Weisman.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Weisman. You probably know that. You bought your ticket or you came here, made your way after last week's snow date. But I say my name because it has some meaning that I never really thought about. It sounds Jewish. For most of my life, I didn't think very much about that I had a Jewish-sounding name. I grew up in a moderately Jewish household in Atlanta. I grew up in a very Reformed synagogue. I was bar mitzvahed without the encumbrance of a Haftorah portion. I still messed up the prayer after the Torah reading. I thought it was normal that my shul had an electric arc, that the door came down and the lights came on. And we also had a Christian choir that was ensconced behind curtains so it would sound that much more angelic. I went off to Chicago for college, and the only interaction I ever had with Hillel at Northwestern was an argument my senior year with the rabbi over the two-state solution versus the Canton solution. I'm not going to go over that right now because, as I say in my book, I think Jews in the United States discuss Israel way too much. I did insist that my children would be raised Jewish when I married my college girlfriend way, way too young. Now, as you might have guessed, she wasn't Jewish. She was, in fact, the daughter of a lapsed Catholic turned Pentecostalist. My mother-in-law used to ask me what I would call somebody who followed all the tenets of my religion but took Jesus as their savior, and I said I called him a Christian, and that always disappointed her. When my daughters were born, more than 10 years later, I did insist, or I'm sorry, when we were getting married, I insisted that we would raise our daughters Jewish, our children Jewish, but they were born like 10, 12 years later, and my wife at the time felt like she would feel like an alien in her own house if she was the only non-Jew there, and you know, I didn't hold her to a promise that she made really as a child, so we raised them nothing. Now, actually, my daughter told me that I should mention that through her own force of will, my younger daughter did insist on a Jewish education, and although she got it a little belatedly, I will say that it was not too late. I say none of this with any pride. In fact, I say it with a little shame. But my point is this. I was a pretty typical Jew of my generation, and that means not particularly Jewish at all. Until I was, and it was all because of that name, Weisman. In May of 2016, Donald Trump was marauding through the Republican primaries. Somehow, the Republican cognoscenti in Washington thought they were going to stop him from getting the Republican nomination through some undetermined deus ex machina that never manifested itself. At the time, Robert Kagan, a Brookings Institution scholar and a Republican of good standing, wrote a column called "This is How Fascism Comes to America." And as I did often, I took a snippet from it, I put it onto Twitter, and I sent it out into the world. I got an odd reply back from somebody who called himself Cyber Trump. It just said, "Hello, Weisman." That's it, except the Weisman was in 3 parentheses. I didn't know what it meant. I intuited that because Weisman was such a Jewish-sounding name, it had some kind of meaning. So I said, "Care to explain?" And he said, came back, "What ho, the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence, ha, ha, ha." I have It's a dog whistle fool. I have belled the cat for my fellow Goyim. And then the onslaught began. And let me explain what belling the cat meant. I didn't know this at the time. I came to know it later. Unbeknownst to me, an enterprising member of the alt-right, their name, not mine, that strange agglomeration of racists, anti-Semites, white nationalists, and America Firsters, had created a piece of software called a Google plugin. You could get it on Google. It had the bland name of the coincidence indicator, so it wouldn't rise to Google's notice. But if you downloaded the coincidence indicator, you could search for Jews to go after. Google searches don't pick up punctuation marks. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't know that. But if you have the coincidence indicator, you could go for one particular set of punctuation marks with these 3 parentheses. They called them echoes, by the way. A leader of the alt-right named Andrew Anglin, who happens to be this very malicious editor of the Daily Stormer, a neo-Nazi site, had decided that he would slap these parentheses on Jewish targets, mostly Jewish journalists at the time, and then his minions could search and destroy. So I was certainly not the only one. There were dozens of Jewish journalists who were belled, and the results were vicious. I went back to look for some of them recently because I wanted to show people what they looked like. The very worst ones were purged by Twitter, but there are plenty out there, and I do want to show you what they looked like. So I probably shouldn't read all of these with in a house of worship, but they come out right with what it is. It puts the gold star on the chest, or it gets the hose again. This is one of my friends, Daryl Lampshade, a charming name. Quick question, why have the Jews been kicked out of so many countries if they never did anything wrong? Please answer. This is a common theme in the alt-right. They like to make Jews answer to our own oppression. I will just point out that Ari Goldberg is almost certainly not this man's real name. And he uses this is an alt-right cartoon character of the sniveling Jew. He actually has a name. There's a whole, in my book, I explain the whole origin of that cartoon character. And he shows up again and again in alt-right motifs. This is an image of another journalist, Julia Yaffe. Julia Yaffe was, at that time, she works for The Atlantic now. She was a freelance journalist. She had done a profile of Melania Trump, and she had gone back to Slovenia, where Melania's family had come from, and she wrote what I think most journalists thought was a fair and nice profile, but Melania did not like it, and because Melania did not like it, the trolls in the alt-right, they're kind of stormtroopers, decided to go after Julia with great vehemence. Here's a picture of Julia getting her head shot by a Nazi. This is a common motif. You put a journalist in a gas chamber and have Donald Trump throw the switch. I won't necessarily read all these, but here's another one. There's a picture of Daniel Day-Lewis, and I'll just tell you, Daniel Day-Lewis was not a member of the alt-right. He is, at one time, he was in the, I don't know if you all saw it, Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, this epic from the early 19th century, and he played a nativist character named Bill the Butcher, and Twitter allows you to take on any identity you want, and Bill the Butcher just happens to be a common one in the anti-Semitic world. And this is another one that I just bring out because it is another example of how they make you answer to your own oppression. Haven't Jews been kicked out from all nations? It will be your turn soon. I mention this also because we're all fixated rightly on the anti-Semitism that is surging in Europe, and that's an anti-Semitism born of anti-Zionism. You anti-Semites in the kind of new breed of anti-Semites in France and Britain hate Israel. But the alt-right doesn't really hate Israel. The alt-right sees Israel as an ethno-state, and they want an ethno-state. They want a white nation in what is now the United States, and they see Israel as a place for us Jews to go to, and we are not white according to their views. So they're not actually, they don't really fit in with the European concept, this new European concept of anti-Semitism. This is another one. They actually, the thing is that they love to get a rise from the people that they're targeting, so they think it's very funny that there's no business like show of business. I'll just let that one speak for itself. Goebbels. It's kind of funny because the Nazis lost World War II, but they find real heroism in Joseph Goebbels and all things Third Reich. So this is a concept that the Jews run everything in secret, and if the Goyim, if the non-Jews could just discover the secret to how the Jews run everything, then we'll have to shut it down. And this is a thing you hear all the time in the alt-right. The Goyim know, shut it down. And as I said, the alt-right would like us to leave. And they have a place for us to go, Israel. And that's they had empowered Donald Trump to send us away. So that is, I just wanted to show you a few things. We don't need these anymore. And, you know, people often ask me if I was scared during all of this. Did I fear for my life? Did I worry about my children? And perhaps I was foolish, but I didn't. I wasn't really scared. I just wasn't going to be threatened by these 2-bit cyber terrorist Nazis. But, you know, I am scared now. Because since I began writing this book about my own experiences, a follower of what he called the alt-Reich came upon a young black student at the, just outside the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. He demanded that the student step aside from the, on the sidewalk. The student did not step aside. The student was stabbed to death. In Portland, Oregon, 2 men had come to the rescue of a young teenage girl wearing a hijab on the light rail in Portland. They were stabbed to death. Then, of course, came Charlottesville. And the world saw the alt-right jump from the internet to the flesh with their chants of Jews will not replace us, their tiki torches, their melees, and ultimately the death of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, run down by a bigot in a Dodge Charger. So yes, I am scared. And what is to be done? I will confess that my book is pretty hard on Jews, mostly mainline Jewish organizations, those in the big glass edifices in New York and Washington. I know amazing work is being done at the synagogue level, at the congregation level, but I don't think enough is being done right now to counter the rising tide of white nationalism, and not just in the United States, all over, in Hungary, in Poland. White nationalists just won a plurality of the parliament in Italy. The president of Hungary is about to get overwhelmingly reelected after running a campaign really against George Soros, who was obviously not actually on the ballot. Elie Wiesel called American Jewry the Jews of silence for our acquiescence to the oppression of Soviet Jewry. We were pretty feckless in our response to the Holocaust, to be honest, too. During the rise of Hitler, the American Jewish Committee, representing the more affluent, assimilated German Jews, were promoting a kind of quiet advocacy and diplomacy to counter Nazism. The American Jewish Congress, which was a redoubt of more recent arrivals from Eastern Europe, they wanted a brasher approach, rallies, demonstrations, direct appeals to the Roosevelt administration. The rabbis preached widely. There were rallies, but really, to many American Jews, silence was really the response. Why attract attention of the anti-Semites when people like Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford, people of such renown, were actually espousing pro-Nazi views? Why rock the boat and risk the same fate as European Jewry? Like so many moments in American and world history, American Jewry, when facing this existential threat, just really couldn't quite get it together. As I said, there is some really amazing work, and since my book has come out, I've gotten a lot of pushback. I expected the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish federations to defend themselves, and I accept that. And what I haven't expected is a lot of smaller Jewish organizations and synagogues have really come down hard on me and said, what about us? We're doing wonderful things. I'm not saying they aren't. But I would say that if the American Jewish community in all its strength were really coming out against the rise of bigotry in this country and abroad, we would know it. I don't feel like we are seeing that. For decades now, American Jews have argued and argued, but we've argued over Israel. We have our liberal J Street and our more mainline conservative AIPAC. We have the New Israel Fund. We have the American Jewish Committee. And what do they fight over? They fight over Israel. For 25 years, a guy named Ken Stern told me he worked for the American Jewish Committee. He finished his tenure as the director of the Division of Anti-Semitism and Extremism. And when he arrived at the AJC, he told me the committee had an entire floor devoted to domestic issues like education, immigration, inter-ethnic relations, inter-religious outreach. But over time, those concerns were subordinated to the singular focus on Israel. Clean energy? Okay, but make sure it relates to Israeli energy security. Interfaith efforts? Fine, as long as they're geared to heading off the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement against Israel. Outreach to Hispanic communities? Absolutely, they're a rising force in American politics. We need to protect Israel. The American Jewish Committee saw where the big money was. Why chase after $5,000 or $10,000 donations when hedge fund managers were cutting checks of 6 figures or 7 figures? But to get the big money, the committee needed to be more tempered, more conservative, and more focused on Israel. It was the easiest way to focus the American Jewish attention. Israel was born of one of the worst atrocities in human history, certainly the worst atrocity in Jewish history, the Holocaust. Its existence is a testament to the desire to keep Jews safe. But let me tell you, if the United States is a hostile country to the Jew, Israel is not safe. It is by far the largest recipient of American military aid. Israel's Iron Dome missile shield was built with Israeli ingenuity, but also a lot of American help. Israeli engineers actually helped design the Joint Strike Fighter, and Israel's Air Force will be the only one in the Middle East that gets the plane. But when it rolls off that assembly line, it will be rolling off in Fort Worth, Texas, not in Tel Aviv. The fact is that the Jewish haven is only safe as long as it's under the American security umbrella. American Jewry should be at least as focused on keeping the United States safe for Jews as it is for sustaining Israel's security. At the height of the 2016 campaign, when the alt-right dog whistling was all over the place, David Harris, the head of the American Jewish Committee, wrote a column for USA Today, happily recounting how Ivanka Trump had converted to Judaism and how Chelsea Clinton had married Mark Mezvinsky. Oh joy, he exulted. Whoever wins will bring a Jewish family to the White House. This is exactly what he wrote. He said, how American Jewish voters will respond to Donald Trump's Jewish links and pro-Israel statements, and to persistent questions about the support he is receiving from the far right, including white supremacist and anti-Semitic groups, remains to be seen. But if past is prologue, there are likely to be some Jews being both loudly supporting and energetically opposing his candidacy. Welcome to American presidential politics and the Jews in 2016. I have to read this one sentence again. He said, how American Jewish voters will respond to Donald Trump's Jewish links and pro-Israel statements, and to persistent questions about the support he is receiving from far-right, including white supremacist and anti-Semitic groups, remains to be seen. As if a presidential candidate backed by white supremacists and anti-Semites is normal. I mean, come on, we can do better than that. I mean, as I was writing this book, I had lunch with a rabbi in Washington named Daniel Zemel. Being Jewish, we took 3 hours for this lunch, and he's featured in the book a lot. He told me that after Trump was elected president, Shabbat services at Temple Micah that Friday night were packed. Congregants were shell-shocked, they were looking for support, and they were looking for answers. The scene repeated itself the weekend of Trump's inauguration. But 6 miles away from Rabbi Zemel's synagogue, on the evening of December 14th, 2016, the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations gathered for a Hanukkah party, co-hosted by the Embassy of Azerbaijan at the Trump International Hotel. It is not a secret that Azerbaijan's record on human rights abuses is atrocious, but Azerbaijan's relations with Israel are warm. Mort Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, blasted what he called far-left extremists who were objecting to the sight of the Jewish umbrella group partying in the Lincoln Library of the Trump Hotel with diplomats from Azerbaijan. He said, "It would have been terribly unwise for the conference to have pulled out and say, we don't want to have this in the Trump Hotel. If the Trump people became aware of this, they would have been offended." Offended. This was just weeks after the Trump campaign had aired its final ad on television that inveighed against, quote, global special interests, as the Jewish faces of Lloyd Blankfein from Goldman Sachs and Janet Yellen from the Fed were going across the screen. I mean, forget about dog whistles. This was like a foghorn. Or as Rabbi Zemel put it, let's face it, the American Jewish community has been abandoned by its leaders. I want to be clear here about one thing. I am not saying that the Jewish response to the rise of anti-Semitism and white nationalism should be uniform adoption of left-wing politics. Some of the most articulate and passionate denunciations of our drift toward an intolerant authoritarianism have come from conservatives, conservative Republicans, and especially conservative Republican Jews. The defense of American institutions, those lefty concepts as the Constitution, or the rule of law, or law enforcement, or American intelligence, these should not be considered Democratic or Republican endeavors. These are American. There are certain lines that neither party is supposed to cross: bigotry, racism, authoritarianism. That's not liberal or conservative. That is American. In closing, bear with me. I want to share an obscure story that has real meaning to me. Back in 2014, before really anyone had heard of the alt-right, the vicious lads in their parents' basements who played video games and were hanging out on these kind of fever swamps of places like 4chan and 8chan and Reddit. These are online chat groups that you probably don't even know exist. They collectively decided that a small group of women video game writers had to be destroyed. Their offense was that they were writing video games for women. They had video games like for depression. They had a video game that didn't, run prostitutes over for points or shoot down basically anybody. So they attacked, and they used all these tricks that the alt-right would eventually adopt. They doxed. That means they published personal information, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers online, so anybody could go attack these women in person or attack their bank accounts or steal their identities. They also did this thing called swatting, which is where they would call the local police station near the women's houses and say, hey, I see there's a man with a gun in this house, and send the SWAT team over to raid. It's a terrible thing. Even if the people are okay, often dogs get shot. In the case of Zoe Quinn, a bitter ex-boyfriend had joined this whole thing, and he compiled a mix of innuendo, sexually explicit kiss-and-tell stories, exaggerations, and falsehoods into something he called the Zoe Post. And then he put it online on 4chan. And he knew the loudest denizens that were involved in what's called Gamergate would attack, and they did. The horrors that were visited on Zoe Quinn boggle the mind. Her Wikipedia site was altered to read, died October 14th, 2014. That happened to be the date of her next public appearance. Social media posts urged her to kill herself, pictured her covered in semen, and the threat, I mean, things like, if I ever see you are doing a panel at an event, I will literally kill you. Or, we have to rape Zoe Quinn and take everything from her. We have to ruin her life. Remember, all this woman did was design video games. So what happened to Zoe Quinn was horrific, but it was also important because at that point, most of the racists and the anti-Semites were living in their own little worlds. They had Stormfront and the Daily Stormer and these Klan websites, and they were just talking to each other. But when they saw what the misogynist lads could do to these women, they said, aha, it was like a signal flare. They realized, wow, we can do this too. We can spread our hate, but we need to leave our little cloistered world, and we need to go on to sites like 4chan and 8chan, even the discussion rooms of YouTube, and eventually Twitter. And by doing that, they made sure that a whole new generation would just stumble into it. You know, the shooter in Parkland was kind of swimming in this cesspool. People are just running into it, and they're learning about these new ideologies out there because it's now much, much more easy to spread, much easier to get the word out. And I bring this also up for a more uplifting point. Zoe Quinn is an amazing woman. With her boyfriend, who happens to be a yeshiva guy named Alex Lifshitz, they started an outfit called Crash Override. It was a support service for victims of abuse online, for social workers, for lawyers, for cybersecurity experts. And the Crash Override website offers these practical tools on how to combat this kind of abuse. It wasn't particularly about anti-Semitism, it was just abuse, although anti-Semitism was always part of it. In its first year, Crash Override had a hotline. In 2015, Zoe Quinn personally handled more than 1,000 calls. She eventually had to shut it down because she personally couldn't do it all herself. It was just killing her. So what would it mean to Zoe, our countless victims out there, if Jewish wherewithal, if Jewish money and might and organizational skills were put behind something like Crash Override, if we actually did practical things to combat what's happening online? In a society where intolerance and hatred and just plain nastiness are suddenly far more tolerated, anti-Semitism is just one of many horrors, one of many that include Islamophobia, attacks on immigrants, racism. But we're all in this together. Anti-Semitic hate crimes rose 57% in 2017 over 2016. That's the largest single year jump in record, and that came after another big jump in 2016 during the campaign. Anti-Semitic assaults have rose 34% in 2016, but that was more than matched by the attacks on American Muslims, which rose 57%. And where Jews are reporting taunts and disruptions, there's desecration of headstones, spray paints, whatever, Muslim Americans are actually being killed. And there was a girl who was beaten to death outside of Washington. In 1958, when a synagogue in Atlanta, my synagogue, the Temple, was bombed by Klansmen, Ralph McGill, who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, put it succinctly. He said, "You do not preach and encourage hate for the Negro and hope to restrict it to that field. It is an old, old story. When the wolves of hate are loosed on one people, then no one is safe." The wolves of hate have been loosed. It's time we refocus our gaze homeward, to unite around what it means to be Americans and defend democratic pluralism. The world is watching. So, I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you. Thank you. What are some specific things you're speaking of combating anti-Semitism? What specific things can be done?
I feel like, I mean, specifically, as I said, I think there are systems to combat, to work with the FBI and to work with, actually James Comey was speaking to the Anti-Defamation League about some of this, and he was talking about efforts to unite Jewish organizations with the FBI to start reporting and going after online hate and trying to shut down some of the websites. He may not have gotten very far because he was fired 2 days later, but it was an important moment. And I think the Anti-Defamation League is doing a lot of work. And you know, the Anti-Defamation League, I bring them up because obviously, you know, there's some controversy about the new leadership of the ADL. Abe Foxman was always a very diplomatic man. He was very careful. He did not want to be seen as a liberal or a conservative. The new leader, Jonathan Greenblatt, has been more out front, and he's been criticized by some Jewish Republicans because they think that by being outspoken against anti-Semitism and bigotry on the right, somehow he is speaking out against Donald Trump. I don't think that that's correct. But I think that the Anti-Defamation League deserves our support. You know, when the Anti-Defamation League actually put together what he called a guide to the alt-right, alt-light, and it went through a list of some of the characters that are out there leading these movements. And some of the characters that they listed are pretty prominent supporters of Trump. And some Jewish Republican politicians came out against the Anti-Defamation League and said they were standing with Mike Cernovich or this other guy. I mean, it was shocking, and I thought, wow. And I didn't hear the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress or the New York Jewish Federation stand up and say, we stand actually with the Anti-Defamation League. I didn't hear anything. And I think that standing for our institutions and moving them to a more aggressive position is really important for the American Jewish community. I think she's controlling the mic. So.
As a former president of the American
I'm sorry, we were just having a question back there.
Hi. I just wonder, where is Jared Kushner? Does he know what's going on?
You know, so the question was, where is Jared Kushner? You know, the fact that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were going to be in this White House is kind of a talisman for you know, for anyone who thought everything's fine, everything's fine. But I mean, ultimately, you know, if some people are reluctant to speak up, certainly members of the Trump family have been reluctant to speak up. And remember, during the campaign, Melania Trump was asked about these attacks on Julia Yaffe, and she said, well, she provoked it. And Donald Trump was asked in an interview with Wolf Blitzer about this kind of swarming alt-right and the anti-Semitism and the racism coming from his supporters, and he said, I don't control my supporters. And I don't pretend to know what's in Donald Trump's mind. I'm not calling him an anti-Semite. I don't. But I will say that, I mean, we have not exactly seen forthright opposition to the swirl of bigotry that has kind of come in the wake of this campaign. You know, there's a study that I cite in my book about this group of economists actually writing in a peer-reviewed journal talked about taking a group of people before the election and saying that we are going to contribute. If you want, we can contribute anonymously to this anti-immigration group. And most of the people that were being studied said, I don't want you to do that. Even anonymously, I don't want you to do that. And then they studied over time during the course of the election as more and more people said, yeah, you know, just do it quietly. And then after the election, the same group of people came back and like 70% of them wanted contributions to this group. I mean, And I'm not saying that anti-immigration is necessarily alt-right bigotry. It's not the same. But I will say that, you know, the mores of a polite society are dropping, and I think that that's what we are seeing around us. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the other person. I thought I was recognized. I just want to comment on a few of your comments that I think are grossly inaccurate. First of all, you focus on alt-right anti-Semitism, and I share that anti-Semitic concern about it. You fail to acknowledge at all extreme left anti-Semitism or Nation of Islam anti-Semitism that exists as well. So a more balanced approach would have been important. Secondly, you fail to recognize that the American Jewish Committee formed the Muslim-Jewish Coalition for the express purpose of fighting anti-Semitism, hatred, and the lack of pluralism. Similar things associated with Latino Coalition, where we formed that as well. And lastly, it would have been helpful if just talking about one former employee of the AJC, you had met with David Harris or members of the staff to find out what we're doing on a global basis to fight anti-Semitism, not only the United States and in Europe as well. So I invite you to come to lunch one day and have some facts, so on your book tour, you represent things as they are, not as you've selectively portrayed by the input of one person.
Okay, I actually am meeting with leaders of the federations and some AJC leaders in California in a couple of weeks, and I will say, I will repeat. If the American Jewish Committee and the mainline Jewish organizations were forthrightly standing up, I think that we would see it, and we are not. We are not. So I will say, I mean, you and I can disagree on this, and I get it. Now, I do want to address the Nation of Islam and anti-Semitism of the left, and I always expected to talk about this. In fact, I discuss it in my book at length. I didn't discuss it in this talk, but I will discuss it right now. The Nation of Islam, I mean, the gutter hatred and bigotry that Louis Farrakhan has expressed is, you know, is as hateful and as bigoted and anti-Semitic as anything we've ever seen out of the alt-right. There's no question. And I condemn Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam's version of anti-Semitism. I will also say this. Louis Farrakhan in 1995 organized the Million Man March. I think it's about 500,000 black men came to the Million Man March. That was pretty much the pinnacle of Louis Farrakhan's power. The Nation of Islam is a small organization. It is present in urban centers around the country, but it is not a swelling movement. In fact, Louis Farrakhan cannot put 100,000 fascists on the streets of Budapest. Louis Farrakhan cannot pass a measure through the Parliament of Poland saying it is illegal to say that Poles had anything to do with the Holocaust. Louis Farrakhan has not grabbed a plurality of the Italian parliament, and Louis Farrakhan did not make the final runoff for the presidency of France. So I would say that we have to focus on where the movement is, where the threat is. And I do not believe that Louis Farrakhan and his brand of hatred is a rising threat, the way white nationalism is. White nationalism is a rising threat throughout the West. These are not equal. Now, I will also talk about the anti-Semitism of the left through anti-Zionism and the BDS movement. Now, I will tell you, what's happening in France and Britain is really frightening. It's very, I mean, if you're French and you are seeing, you know, anti-Israeli sentiment rise up to the point where people are chanting in the street, "Death to the Jews," and a Holocaust survivor could be murdered in her flat. And at the same time, Marine Le Pen is mobilizing an entire movement from the right. You have it coming from the right, and you have it coming from the left. That is horrifying. I will also talk about the BDS movement in the United States. Obviously, there are Jews, and I know them, who are on campuses right now who feel uncomfortable with the anti-Israeli sentiment in liberal organizations on campuses. I will also tell you, I have a stepdaughter. She's at Barnard, just up the street. She is bat mitzvahed. She is incredibly Jewish identified. She loves being Jewish. She also hates Israel. Now, I will tell you, if you want to argue with her on policy, if you want to make the case that her position on Israel is wrong, and you're going to argue why it's wrong, you should. But if you're going to call her an anti-Semite, you will get nowhere, because she is not an anti-Semite. She is somebody who really does not like Israel. And I sit and argue with her about this a lot, but I am not so silly as to call my own stepdaughter an anti-Semite who loves being Jewish. So I draw a great distinction between the BDS movement. You know, I talked about, at the beginning of that thing, I talked about the argument that I had with a rabbi at Hillel over the two-state solution versus the Canton solution. And I remember when I was a senior in college, I wrote, this was in 1988, I wrote a column that said, if Israel cannot actually forthrightly settle the Palestinian crisis, then someday we're going to lose a generation of Jews we're going to rise up with the occupation as what they think of as Israel. And nothing was done, and now we have. And that's scary. And I think that that is something to be addressed, but it is not to be addressed in a discussion about anti-Semitism.
Do you think that social media has created more anti-Semitism, or do you think that social media is just reflecting the existing anti-Semitism in America? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think, obviously, I think social media exposed anti-Semitism that is ancient and long-standing in corners of the American culture. But I will also say that it has created an avenue to spread this form of bigotry and also just conspiracy theories. You know, there's this guy, his name is PewDiePie. I won't spell you his name, PewDiePie, but he's like this YouTuber. He's from Sweden. My kids, you know, my teenage girls used to love him. They've kind of outgrown him. But PewDiePie did this thing where he hired these guys from India for $5 to do something, and he wouldn't say what it was. And then he said, to see what the guys from India would do. And what he did was he was shocked because they actually did it. They unfurled a banner somewhere in India that said "Death to the Jews," and danced around with it. And everyone, like all these kids, saw this, and PewDiePie was like pretended to be aghast and embarrassed that this actually happened. But the fact that he even thought to do that, and the fact that kids, you know, 11-year-old boys who love PewDiePie saw these Indian boys in a jungle dancing around with a sign that said "Death to the Jews," that's scary to me. Because, you know, it used to be harder to get your word across. Now it's really easy. It's really easy to get your message out. And kids are swimming in this cesspool online that it's almost hard to avoid at this point.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I'm glad you got to the ADL. I was going to ask you about that because you didn't mention it in your talk, but it was brought up in a question. But what is in Donald Trump's mind is the $64,000 question, and I would say that the attitude of most citizens of the state of Israel, and of course Netanyahu, in sharp comparison to Barack Obama's lack of popularity in Israel, largely answers that question. I would agree that a more forceful denunciation of the hateful side of some of Donald Trump's supporters. And you said he made the comment, well, I can't control the attitude of supporters. Is there any evidence at all that he in any way has supported anti-Semitism in any form?
Well, look, there's actually a lot of stories around about his childhood and about his father. I've heard these things. We've never, at the New York Times, we've been written about them because we've actually tried very hard to find out, the validity of them, and it's hard to. Of course, we have written about, the history of redlining blacks out of Trump Organization buildings and things like that. But I will say that there are weird things that happen in this White House. Now, Trump will retweet a meme of, remember that tweet of the guy who was wrestling, it was Trump wrestling a CNN guy to the ground and smashing his head. Well, it only took about a few clicks to find that same person who put together that image had put together the most noxious, racist, anti-Semitic images also. Now, I spend time on social media. I would not have run across that. How did Donald Trump find that guy? I mean, he's actually done it many times, and there was during the campaign quite a few times he was trucking in imagery that was just kind of one step removed from blatant racism and blatant anti-Semitism, and it was one step removed, but these were images that wouldn't have been easy to find unless you were somehow swimming around in the 4chan, 8chan cesspool. It's a question that I've always wanted to know, and we've at the New York Times, we've actually tried to figure it out. This guy, Brad Parscale, who runs his social media operation. He was just named his campaign manager for 2020. I'm sure Brad Parscale must know how in the world these images crop up in the messages coming out of the White House. But we don't know, and I don't want to, make inferences here.
I have the mic. During the Charlottesville protests, one of the chants was, "Jews will not replace us." And Trump said that these were good people. To me, that's anti-Semitic. During the campaign, there was a picture of Hillary Clinton superimposed on a 6-pointed Jewish star taken from an anti-Semitic website, and that was used in one of Trump's ads. So and then when they interviewed some people in Charlottesville, a lot of the men were very angry that Trump's daughter married a Jew.
Yes.
So if that's, and anti-Semitism has gone up 57% since Trump has been president. And he was not elected. He was not elected president. He was appointed by the Electoral College, which was not elected. So if that isn't anti-Semitism, and if dog whistles, what is? He's an anti-Semite, plain and simple, even though his daughter is married to a Jew. Question.
That I will say that image of the Jewish star with Hillary Clinton is one of the main examples that I say of that they are somehow that campaign was swimming in some very filthy waters, and I would agree with that. And what happened in Charlottesville, what I hope was a wake-up call for everyone, because Jews will not replace us is it originally was you will not replace us, but in the alt-right world, in the white nationalist world, white nationalists believe that there's something called white genocide going on. And in white genocide, there are African Americans and Latino Americans and Muslim Americans, and they're all taking over for the white people. But it's hard for them, the white nationalists, to understand this because they believe that African Americans and Latinos and Muslims are inferior creatures to them. So how could it be that they are being supplanted, they're being beaten by these inferior creatures? And the answer is Jews, because in their great pantheon, they have decided that the Jews are the puppet masters running all of this.
I don't want to appear naive, and I don't, well, with the emergence of so many Muslim people, I don't want that to appear prejudiced, but they have infiltrated into the majority of the populations of many countries. And I have always felt that perhaps the emergence of hearing so much hate, if it's coming from the Muslims in terms of Israel or in terms of anything, has caused a lot of anti-Semitism. Does that make me sound terrible? I don't mean to say the Muslims aren't good people, but I feel the emergence of their group in such large numbers has created this hatred.
I need a question.
Oh, the question. Okay. So the question is this true?
Well, as I said earlier, I draw a distinction between white nationalist anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that is emerging out of the left in Europe, which is born of anti-Zionism. And what you are seeing in France is these pincers, where you have white nationalists, you have a nationalist movement in the National Front coming at Jews from the right, and you have a lot of Islamic immigrants or second-generation Muslims in France coming at Jews from the left. And it is creating a horrific situation. There's no question about it. I do not see that happening in the United States. I mean, on campuses, I see certainly an anti-Israel sentiment, an anti-Zionist sentiment, but I don't feel like Muslims have that much power. But they do. I think that that Islamic Muslim immigrants in Europe are certainly exerting pressure on their societies to oppose Israel, and that has had this odd metastasis into anti-Semitism, where basically, if you were a Jew in France or you're a Jew in Britain, you're made to answer for Israel, and we shouldn't be made to answer for the policies of another nation. We are our own.
Settlement policies or for Israel?
For Israel. I mean, for Israel. It's abroad. It's like you must renounce Israel or you will be attacked as some kind of racist. And that is a sentiment that we are seeing more and more. It's very scary.
You talk about Jewish organizations coming together, trying to deal more with the subject of the anti-Semitism that's arising. But I wonder if we'd ever get the Orthodox in any significant numbers to join us. I get the impression, I live in an area in Brooklyn that's rather Orthodox, and they voted in large numbers for Trump. Mm-hmm. And even the few times I brought up somewhere about Charlottesville, I got a very muted response. I get the feeling that because President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, they want to overlook this, the other aspect that with Charlottesville, I get that feeling that, and even in my own family, I have a nephew who wasn't raised that way, became Orthodox. I tried to bring up the subject with him. He shut me up. He said, well, Uncle Peter, I don't deal with those issues. It's like he didn't want to know.
I actually talk about this in my book a lot. In fact, I open my book with this. The notion that there are kind of this development of the tribalist Jews versus the internationalist Jews. And the internationalist Jews feel like the Jewish community thrives at a time when walls come down, when borders are blurred, when we are less nationalist. But the tribalist Jews actually thrive in a kind of an era of nationalism. And there are a lot, not all, but there are a lot of Orthodox Jews who are, tribalist identified. Everything comes down to Israel for them because, Fortress Israel, that is it. So they are willing, the desire to move that embassy, it's like, it literally is, they had a consulate in Jerusalem and an embassy in Tel Aviv, and they're moving the sign from like the consulate to the embassy, and now it's an embassy, but that had such incredible meaning to so many Jews, and I would call those the tribalist Jews. And right now, the tribalists and the internationalists are really at odds, and that focal point is coming into the Trump administration.
I guess partially I wanted to speak about that. What do you say to the Trump supporter who is Jewish and who's voting and who supports Trump blindly, as far as I'm concerned, because they feel, it feels that Trump is going to be better for Israel? I mean, without looking at what he's doing here, all they care about is that he's better for Israel. I mean, well, how do you answer that? What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not here to speak. I'm not here to oppose Donald Trump, but I am here to say that I do believe, and as I said in my talk, I do believe that Israel ultimately is only as safe as the United States is safe for the Jews. I mean, if the United States turns to be a hostile power to Jews, how much longer do you think that we are going to be, sending $5 billion of military aid a year? How much longer do you think the United States is going to be the constant partner to Israel if anti-Semitism wells up here? I mean, you're already seeing it in Europe. The British government is under pressure to cut ties with Israel because of this rising sentiment of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. That will happen here too. And I would just say, we have ultimately a responsibility to keep the United States a democratic, pluralist society.
Which is not what's happening.
And well, I talk about this in the book too. I mean, for the longest time, it felt like the United States was inexorably, slowly progressing toward a more inclusive, pluralist, democratic society. And it kind of reached its apotheosis in 2008. In 2008, we were in the middle of an unbelievable financial collapse. And it was a time people were, hundreds of thousands of people were losing jobs every month. It was a time when you could have seen this uprising of hatred and suspicion, and we elected our first black president. And everyone said, wow, we really are a country that is inexorably moving toward acceptance and inclusiveness. And you know what? Right now we aren't. So the question is, are we is this moment the aberration and we'll move back toward that progression toward acceptance? Or are we going to look back and think, actually, those years between 1960 and 2008 were actually the aberration? And that's why this moment in American history is so important.
Do you feel that it's particularly challenging to fight alt-right nationalism given the rise for some time of some ultra-right groups in Israel that, while they are a minority, have a significant influence on Israeli policies? Does it become difficult because Israel becomes associated to some degree with those parties? We know that's true on the left, but is it also more difficult to fight it on the right?
I think that it is incumbent on American Jews to teach the rising generation of young Jews to identify with Judaism as a religion and not as a nation. And I think that this is one of the problems with, I think, the American Jewish community is that it has become so self-identified with Israel that we get into these conundrums. Why should it matter that there is a harsh, strain of nationalism and bigotry in Israel to me? I don't think it should. But the reason is because because American Jews have become so inextricably linked to Israel that we are answerable to political trends, 8,000 miles away or 3,000 or whatever it is. And I think that that's a problem for us because I think, as I said, I think that it's time for the American Jewish community to really stand up for American values. And if that means, a little less emphasis on Israel and Israeli politics, all the better.
I'm a Holocaust survivor. I've been very involved. I'm a Holocaust survivor. For many years, I've been involved with the museum in Washington. Their logo is Never Again. Mm-hmm. And every time I go to their meetings, and I'm in Washington next week, and I hear Never Again in my lifetime for 70 years, it is Ever Again. And it's happening. And I, as a child who went through I'm from Hungary, from Budapest. I went through the birth and rise of Mussolini and of Hitler, who started out appealing to the young people and making the place better. There's such a parallel. And I mentioned this to several friends, and they all kind of said, agree. It's exactly what's happening now with Mr. Trump as president. I don't know if he's anti-Semitic or what he is, but 57% is really, really scary.
2 weeks before the election, I was giving a talk to a group of elderly Marylanders just outside of Washington, and I was talking about my experiences with the alt-right, and I was saying, in 2 weeks, Hillary Clinton is going to be elected president. And we're going to look back and we're going to wonder if what we saw during this campaign was the last gasp of a dying movement, or was it the birth of a kind of irredentist white nationalism. And then I was wrong. But I remember after the speech, a Holocaust survivor pulled me aside and said, I wouldn't be so confident about the outcome of this election, and I would not be so confident that this is going to be something that fades away, because I've seen it too. There is something about nationalism that really brings out the worst in people. And we are in a nationalist age right now. When there's a reporter for the Times, David Sanger, was interviewing Trump during the election, and Trump was trying to describe his foreign policy. And David Sanger said, well, would you call it an America First policy? And he said, yes, I would call it an America First policy. And then he started using this all the time. And I think at first he didn't understand the resonance of what America First gave. He didn't understand that that was Lindbergh's party. He didn't understand that it was associated with Nazi sympathies. But then at some point, somebody must have told him, right? But he keeps using it. There is a power to nationalism that unleashes ill wind, and we are in the middle of an ill wind right now.
We have time for one more question, but before we take it, I wanted everyone to know that the sanctuary is open after the book sign if anybody would like to see our beautiful sanctuary. Who's got the last question right here?
Thanks. Is it on? Yes. So I think it would be very helpful to focus on what needs to be done and what we can do. And one thing that needs to be done is we need to flood the internet with messages of tolerance and equality. Another thing we need to do is flood university campuses with the same message. Now, I don't personally know how to do these things, but I'd like some help. Mm-hmm. And we need to get the message out, and it doesn't matter whether it comes from this American Jewish organization or that one that I always give $36 to. But how do we organize? Let's organize like the students in Parkland, and let's do it.
At the synagogue level, amazing things are happening. I talked about in the book. I talk about this organization in Nashville called Noah that is linked 2 mosques, like 3 synagogues, and a bunch of different churches, white, black, together into this umbrella organization that is doing wonderful interreligious work. And I think you see it, there's organizations all over the country in small scales, but they really are giving people an option. And there are, new organizations, Jewish organizations like Bend the Ark, and Jewish Council for Public Affairs is trying to get more public about these things. I think that there is an effort, and it's kind of up to us to encourage it and to join. But because I think if you look, you will find avenues for that.
Okay, so I think we want to thank Jonathan. And join us in the hallway. We'll get him to sign your books, but please don't attack him with your questions there. Let him sign the books.